bear. That's part of how democracy works. But the fact that we have contentious debates within our own countries, the fact that we have political problems that we have to struggle through, in no way discredits us from speaking up for democratic institutions, both at home and around the world. And any kind of notion that the only kind of democracy that can speak out for democratic institutions is one with no news at home is frankly an anti-democratic notion.
Good answer. That's the answer I should have given. Patrick Wintour from The Guardian.
Could I ask the Foreign Secretary, your new special envoy on media freedom just talked about the possibility of using sanctions if necessary if a country is breaching the kind of code you might be thinking of. And I'm just thinking of some of the countries with which the UK has its closest relationships, which are Turkey, Myanmar, and the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia. Can you realistically tell me that you would consider taking sanctions against any of those countries over an issue of media freedom? And if I could briefly ask the Special Envoy whether the issue is not really one of law. You know about, there's many international covenants about media freedom. The issue is will, and a conflict between a view about liberal democracy and a more authoritarian view where democracy doesn't apply and should not apply. That's deemed as Western values.
So, Patrick, the first point I would say is in a post-Brexit context, Britain will have complete sovereign control of our sanctions policy in a way that we don't have now. So we'll actually have the ability to make those choices. And we have always shown that we're willing to have difficult conversations against countries that are our friends and our strategic partners as much as we do with countries that we don't have those close relationships. And part of what we are seeking to do with this campaign is to create an international consensus around what is and isn't acceptable behaviour, to strengthen the international norms around the protection of journalists. And, you know, we are not saying that we're going to behave in the same way in every single situation, because championing human rights doesn't work like that. But absolutely, we want to be taking a lead, and that's what I hope we do.
So I think some of it is about law, where you have journalists who are being prosecuted in countries all over the world under laws like sedition, blasphemy, lèse-majesté, criminal defamation, insulting the regime and things like that. There is definitely a lot that can be done to encourage national reform of those laws, particularly since these same states have, for the most part, ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So their national laws are not complying with their own international commitments. So this is not about Western standards being imposed on other countries. It's about the countries being made to live up to their own commitments. They've ratified these treaties. They want to be members of these bodies. So they should be held to account for that. I think the other part, in another sense, you're right. It's not only about law, because you have to work on enforcement. And that's why all of the types of ideas that I outlined are supposed to raise the costs for those who don't actually comply with their commitments, where there is no political will to actually do what they're supposed to do. So things like having a proper investigative body, things like sanctions or other types of penalties, I think are those kinds of mechanisms that would make a real difference if they existed at the multilateral level and were triggered under the right circumstances.
And I just want to say, Patrick, sanctions definitely can be put in place. They can be used. Two of the countries that you named, Myanmar and Saudi Arabia, Canada has imposed, using our Magnitsky legislation, sanctions on both of those countries. And the United States, using its Magnitsky legislation, has imposed sanctions on Saudi Arabia as well, specifically connected to the murder of Khashoggi. So it can be done. And as Jeremy said, the UK has that kind of legislation in place. And I just want to emphasize, I think one of the things which is so appealing to Canada about Jeremy's initiative is countries can sometimes hesitate to act on our principles if we feel we will be acting alone, and we may face reprisal for doing so. Acting with a group of like-minded countries who have intentionally come together as a group, I really believe will give us all an ability to act more forcefully and more effectively.
Victor Mallet, is Victor here? Victor, do you want to ask a question? Just
well, that's very kind of you. Of course, press freedom is very close to my heart in particular, but I'm afraid I want to ask you about this Brexit thing, because journalists are also dying to be freed from the Brexit dramas, I'm sure, as I'm sure politicians are as well. Just on this issue of an extension, which has come up today, I mean, how can you get an extension without holding European elections? How does that work? I mean, the April 12th deadline was put there for a very specific reason. And, you know, how are you going to square that circle?
Well, the reality is that if you extend beyond April the 12th, you are accepting there is a possibility of having to fight EP elections. But it is, if you are able to get the withdrawal agreement ratified before the 22nd of May, then you might not actually have to fight them. And there is zero appetite in the UK for fighting EP elections. Everyone wants this issue resolved so that we can get on and you can write stories about different things. And so the objective through everything that we are doing is to try and create sufficient agreement in Parliament, one way or another, to allow us not to fight EP elections. And, you know, the Prime Minister is absolutely determined to leave no stone unturned in that respect. Yes.
Two questions. Thank you. For all three of you. First is on Julian Assange. We're hearing that he may be expelled within hours or days from the Ecuadorian embassy. Do you have any information for us on that, and what do you think should happen to him if he is? The second question is about Libya, a place where journalists have a very hard time working, have been taken hostages, have died, etc. We're hearing Haftar, the strongman, is going to march on Tripoli. He's calling on his people to march on Tripoli. What is your comment on that, all three of you? Thanks.
Chrystia, do you want to go first?
You can go first.
Okay. Well, on Assange, I don't have anything to say except that he is free to leave the Ecuadorian embassy whensoever he wishes. We're obviously watching the situation in Libya very, very carefully, with a great deal of concern, and we're seeking to maximise British influence, European influence in that situation to try and resolve the situation as best we can.
Yeah, and I'll just say on Libya, in addition to having this great conversation with all of you, the reason that Jeremy and I are here today is for a meeting of the G7 foreign ministers, and Libya will certainly be on the agenda. On the way here, we already have talked about it. I already have talked about it with the Italian foreign minister. Italy has long-standing and strong views about Libya, so it's definitely something that I think we're all very concerned about.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. My name is Atsushi Takemoto with Kyodo News. I have two quick questions. About this new media freedom project. How are you going to work with the United States government, which sees media as enemy? And my second question is about the G7 meeting. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, is not attending this time. And how do you think it will, the absence would affect the ministerial talk?
Do you want to go first?
Sure, I want to go first. So on the United States, when it comes to the U.S., speaking for Canada, we are not only friends and allies, we are neighbors. We have an incredibly close relationship with the United States. We have the world's longest unmilitarized border. That border is marked by flower pots in many places, and in many places it's not even marked at all. So we feel very close to the Americans and that we know them very, very well. It's certainly the case that in the United States, as in Canada, as in, I think, all liberal democracies right now, the erosion of and attacks on liberal democracy are not just happening in authoritarian regimes, they're happening inside our own countries. And I think that's a reason for us to be all particularly concerned. I would say, though, one of the things that I admire both as a Canadian and as a former journalist is the absolute strength and robustness of the U.S. media, which is really marvelous to behold. And I do think, we certainly, while we live very closely to the Americans and work very closely with them, we have our differences. As my country's chief negotiator of NAFTA, I can tell you about a few of them. But at the end of the day, we very much realize and see the United States as the world's leading liberal democracy, and we have a lot more in common, overwhelmingly more in common with the United States than we have differences. I've just arrived here from Washington, where I was at the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting. It's the 70th anniversary of NATO, and Secretary Pompeo hosted a fantastic meeting of the NATO allies, marking the 70th anniversary of what I think is the world's most successful alliance. So we felt he was very engaged in working with all of us. I had a very good bilateral meeting with him as well. I think we all regret that Mike is not here with us, but his very able deputy, John Sullivan, is going to be here, and I'm sure America will be well represented by him.
Yeah, I would just say this about the US. Every time there is a presidential election, however repressive other countries might be, however undemocratic they might be, the one thing they can't do is stop their own citizens understanding that this is a country in which the people of the country are choosing their leader. And that is about the most powerful advocacy for democracy that you could imagine. And I think that, as Chrystia said earlier, when great democracies like the United States and the UK and indeed Canada have big challenges in our own democracies, the signal we're sending is that actually we resolve these issues through a free press. We resolve them without violence on the streets. We resolve them peacefully. And we don't pretend that we don't have huge debates. Brexit is one of those debates. But we're actually proud that we have institutions that allow us to resolve those debates peacefully. And that, in the end, is what this whole campaign is about. Let's go. Yes, sir.
Cyber efforts. How concerned are you with the upcoming elections in Canada of foreign meddling in your elections, particularly from Russia? And maybe more generally for Mr. Hunt, how do you see the relationship with Russia in this context? Thank you.
Yeah. We are very concerned. I think our judgment is interference is very likely. And we think there have probably already been efforts by malign foreign actors to disrupt our democracy. What I think we're seeing is something that is happening in many liberal democracies, which is the effort is not so much to secure a particular outcome in an election. The effort is to make our societies more polarized and to make us, as citizens of democracies, more cynical about the very idea that democracy exists and that it can work. So we're very mindful of it. We in Canada, led by my excellent colleague Corinna Gould, who is the Minister for Democratic Institutions, have put a number of measures in place to get us ready to defend ourselves. A very important one is just to be sure that Canadians are aware of the danger. One of the things we've learned, especially from talking to our friends in the Baltic states,